If you want wealth in your life, you can't get up as a person in lack. You better get up as the wealthiest woman you ever met. And your body has to be convinced emotionally that you're experiencing that future reality in the present moment, because your body is the unconscious mind, does not know the difference between an experience in your life that produces an emotion that you fabricate just by thought alone. To the body, it experiences it emotionally as if it was happening. So you can begin to change your body to be ahead of the environment by signaling new genes in new ways, because a new emotion is new information from the environment, and that's when the body begins to believe that you are wealthy. So it was 1986, and I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California, and I got run over by a truck, and I broke 6 bones in my spine, and one of the vertebrae was more than 60% collapsed, and I had bone fragments on my spinal cord, and was told I'd probably never walk again, and that I was, scheduled to have this radical surgery called the Harrington rod surgery, where they take out the back parts of your vertebrae, pretty much from the base of my neck to the base of my spine, and screw in these long stainless steel rods, and then patch it up with bone fragments from my hip. And I had 4 opinions from 4 of the leading surgeons in Southern California, and they were pretty clear that that was my only choice. And I was young enough, I think, at the time, and innocent enough to really think about the choice and deciding if I wanted to spend the rest of my life on medications and being in pain, or if I was willing to take a simple chance. And the idea that I had was that the power that made the body healed the body. And I believed in that because that was the principle that I lived by. Now, when you have broken bones like that and there's bone fragments on the cord, of course, this is a little different situation, because I knew that the power that made the body heals the body with things like cuts and flus, but this was really changing matter. This was really changing the structure of my body. So I figured out a couple things. Number one, I wasn't going anywhere. I went from a busy guy to all of a sudden laying face down and not going anywhere. So I wasn't going out and being social or working out or seeing patients or doing anything. I was pretty much brought to a standstill. So I said, look, I got all this time. If this intelligence is real, then I'm going to make contact with it, and I'm going to give it very specific orders, very specific template, and I'm going to show it exactly what I want, and then I'm going to surrender to this intelligence and let it do the healing for me. Well, it sounded really good, but then I didn't realize at the time how unfocused my mind was, because I figured if I was going to give it a very clear picture, that if I started thinking about that I would never walk again, or should I sell my clinic, or whatever thought I had in my mind, halfway through this reconstruction process, I rebuilt every vertebrae in my mind. If I became distracted, I would start all over again. So I spent hours in the beginning creating this model, and after a period of time, it started getting easier. And so I also said to myself, I'm not going to let any thought go by that I don't want to experience. And now that was the tough one. So all of a sudden, I became Gandalf on the bridge, saying, you may not pass, quite a bit. And the first 4 or 5 weeks was a battle against the monster for the most part. And then right around the 6th week, it started getting easier, and my mind started getting sharper, and I started to notice measurable changes in my body. And the moment I could correlate what I was doing inside of me with the results that were being created outside of me, the moment I got that type of feedback, I pretty much locked in. And at 10 and a half weeks, I was back on my feet, and 11 weeks I was back in my office. In 12 weeks I was training again, and they wanted to fit me for a body cast, and I was supposed to wear that for 6 months to a year, and there was just no way that I was going to do that, because when I decided to stand up, I knew I was better. And so that experience, of course, it usually takes trauma or loss or disease or injury or diagnosis, or to get around crisis to begin to change. I think it was a pivotal point in my life because it turned me more into a spiritual person and or at least asking bigger questions. And so I just made myself a deal. I said, if I'm ever able to walk again, I'll spend the rest of my life, studying these concepts, and pretty much that's what I've been doing. After I took the spiritual approach, I started studying spontaneous remissions and traveled around the world and studied people that were diagnosed with really serious conditions, whether it was cancer or diabetes or high blood pressure or chronic pain or lupus or MS, and I wanted to find out what they were doing to get better. In other words, they were treating conventionally or unconventionally, and their condition was either staying the same or getting worse. And I thought, well, hell, all of a sudden they got better. I want to find out what the common things were. And so traveled to 17 different countries, interviewed a lot of people, and filtered it down to 4 common things. And the first thing was that every single person accepted and understood that there was a spiritual intelligence living within them. Not outside of them, somewhere on a cloud, but literally within them. And they said, God, I should be able to make contact with it. It's giving me life, and I've distanced myself from this intelligence. And there's nothing mystical about this intelligence. It's the intelligence that, causes our heartbeat to over 100,000 times in one day, and, hundreds of gallons of blood in an hour. It's just an amazing intelligence that makes trillions of cells every second. And most people never stop to contemplate that something's giving them life. So these people said, look, I can't do this alone. I have to begin to interact with a greater mind. And so that was the first thing they had in common. The second thing was that they understood that it was the reaction to their life, their emotional states, their choices, who they were being that created their condition. And they realized that, for the most part, it was their 10 years of anger or their 30 years of hatred or their, 50 years of fear that really was pushing the genetic buttons that created their condition. And pretty much it's a scientific fact now that we know that the hormones of stress, and stress is when your body's knocked out of balance, those hormones are the chemicals that really begin to sabotage the cell and create disease. And it caused me to do a little research, and I found out that pretty much we can turn on that same stress response just by thought alone. We can think about a past event that's tattooed in the recesses of our gray matter, and like magic, it comes to life. Or we can begin to forecast some worst-case scenario, and we can attend to it to the exclusion of everything else, that our body begins to physiologically change as if it's in that event, in that present moment. And so these people began to realize that one of the greatest habits they had to break was the habit of being themselves, because by thinking certain thoughts and producing certain feelings, the moment they felt the way they were thinking, they began to think the way they were feeling. And they got in this cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And the redundancy of that cycle conditions the body to memorize those emotional states as well as the conscious mind. And whenever the body knows as well as the mind, that's called a habit. Habit is when the body is the mind. And 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of subconscious automatic programs, set of behaviors, emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes that are subconscious, below our conscious awareness. So now when a person wants to change, they're working with 5% of their conscious mind against 95% of what they've memorized. And this is what takes the Herculean effort to begin to make changes, because we have to go into the operating system of the subconscious mind, and that's where all those programs exist in order to make those changes. So they realized that they couldn't continue being themselves any longer. They had to become somebody else, which is really what the third thing was. And they began to reinvent themselves. They began to observe their thoughts, notice their behaviors, pay attention to the feelings that they memorized, and then that concept in neuroscience is called metacognition. The fact that we can observe who we're being means we could modify our behaviors and do a better job in life. And as we become conscious of those unconscious programs, we begin to objectify our subjective mind. We're no longer the program, but the consciousness observing the program. So this is where they began to say, what is a greater ideal of myself? Who do I want to be? How do I want to think? How would greatness feel? How would I behave? And now the neuroscience says that we can change our brain just by thinking, and by them rehearsing new ways of being, thinking about a new way of being. They literally began to reorganize the circuits in their brain and install the neurological hardware so that their brain was primed and changed every time they finished their inward process. And if they did it properly, there came a moment where the thought that they were thinking literally produced an emotional reaction, and they began to feel like that new person. The moment they were feeling like that new person, they were moving into a new state of being, because when thoughts and feelings align, or when mind and body are working together, that's called a state of being. And a state of being is a personality, and a personality creates a new personal reality. So they began to biologically wire their brain and epigenetically signal new genes in their body, and then they began to feel better and literally begin to get better. And the last thing is that they had long moments in their inner process where they lost track of time and space. They were so involved with what they were thinking about that when they opened their eyes or turned on the lights in the room, they expected it to be 20 minutes later, and it was an hour and 20 minutes later. They literally transcended time and space. And when that happens, the frontal lobe, the forebrain, begins to become the CEO and the symphony leader. And it begins to quiet down the emotional centers and all the other circuits in the brain that are connected to the old self. And when that happens, the energy that normally sits in those survival centers moves up into the heart. And when that happens, the person begins to fall in love with the moment, fall in love with themselves, and they literally forget about the old self. And they began to transmute themselves into a new state of being, because they got beyond the old identity. They became nobody, no thing, no time. They became pure consciousness, and that's when we enter the quantum field. Well, let's just suppose that people accept the idea that the way they think has some effect on their life, that their thoughts create their reality, or their thoughts somehow produce some effects in their future destiny. So if you accept that, then neuroscience says that the brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of your environment or a record of your past. So if you wake up every morning and you get out of bed on the same side, and you shut the alarm clock off with the same finger, then you put on your robe and you shuffle into the bathroom, and then you use the toilet like you always do, and then you look in the mirror to remember who you are, and then you get in the shower and you wash yourself off in the same routine way, and you groom yourself to look like everybody expects you to look, and then you go downstairs and drink coffee out of your favorite mug, and then you drive to work the same way you always do, and then you see the same people that push the same emotional buttons, and then you do the things that you've memorized and can do so well, that we could say that during that day, your brain didn't change that much. In fact, you were thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, and living by the same emotions, but secretly expecting something to change in your life. Now, the principle of neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. So as the environment begins to turn on different circuits in your brain, in other words, it's the external environment, the people you see, the places you go, the things you do at different times, and produce those different experiences. As you react to your external environment, it's the environment that's turning on different circuits in your brain, causing you to think equal to everything you know. And as long as you think equal to everything you know, you'll keep creating more of everything you know. You'll keep creating more of the same. So, as your brain fires in the same sequences and the same patterns and the same combinations every single day, that definition is called mind. Mind is the brain in action. So you're reminding yourself of who you think you are equal to everything in your life. Your environment is reaffirming your identity, reaffirming your personality. And if you keep doing that, the brain continues to fire in the same way. It produces a very finite set of circuits, and that finite set of circuits, that box in the brain, there's no literal box, but it's the most commonly fired neurologically wired patterns, that becomes your identity. And that box then is what we call, for the most part, our unchangeable self. So then, To change, then, is to cause the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations to break that hardwired finite signature. And the one ingredient that allows us to do it is knowledge or information. So the key, then, is to change, then, is to think greater than our environment, to think greater than the sensory input that we're picking up every single day that's reflecting back to us. And so most people start out with really good intentions, but in a short amount of time they become seduced by their environment and they return back to the old self. Now, great people in history understood this, and they were already ahead of their environment. They were not believing in their present environment. They were believing in a future reality, and they were so committed to that reality that they began to behave as if that reality was already happening. Now, that is a sign of greatness. So one of the difficulties I think most people have is that we define reality through our senses. That's kind of the Newtonian model of reality, allowing our external environment to regulate how we think and feel. The quantum model is completely the opposite. It says when we change how we think and feel, there should be some effects in our environment. And making that switch, of course, takes quite a bit of effort. You know, quantum model of reality, first of all, tells us that there is a field of information that exists beyond physical space and time. It is really the energy that holds all of this together, and it's an interconnected web of information. And this quantum field is the source where all matter spews from. So you and I, as observers, in other words, Newtonian physics said pretty much that, there is a systematic order in the way the universe works, that because of Newtonian physics we can shoot a rocket to the moon and we can understand, forces and matter and acceleration. The quantum model says something completely unique. It says that mind and matter are not separate in that scenario like Newtonian physics, that mind is matter and matter is mind, and that when someone looks for an electron to measure it in a subatomic way, the electron tends to respond to subjective mind. So that means that there's no experiment in quantum physics without the mind present. So now if we can have an effect on an atom to cause an electron to move from a wave of possibility to collapse into a particle, then is it possible then that we can exert bigger effects in our life? And that's really where we begin to have control of our destiny. The word meditation, the actual translation of the word in Tibetan, what it means literally is to become familiar with. That's what the word means. So if you're sitting and you're with your eyes closed, and you begin to become conscious and familiar with your unconscious thoughts, you begin to become aware and notice your unconscious behaviors and habits, and all of a sudden you begin to pay attention and become familiar with those unconscious emotions, then to know thyself and begin to observe who you're being, that is meditation. Now, most people don't like to hear this because they'd rather turn on the television or get on the internet or call their friend and complain than to really look inward at who they really are. So as we become familiar with those unconscious automatic programs, the process of knowing the thoughts and observing the behaviors and paying attention to the feelings means now we begin to become execute more control over it, so that in our waking day, no thought, no behavior, no emotion slips by unnoticed by us. Now that's when we begin to become conscious of who we really are. Now, and when we do that, nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. And if we're not producing the same thoughts that create the same emotions, then we're no longer signaling the same genes in the same way. So the body begins to have a period where it has a moment of recovery. And if you began to think about a new way of being, and you began to contemplate a greater expression of yourself, and you learned a bit of knowledge, and you began to contemplate and self-reflect on who you wanted to be in your life, a greater expression of yourself, you would begin to fire and wire new circuits in new ways. And as you began to plan your behaviors, your brain wouldn't know the difference between the actual experience that you were doing in your external environment and pretty much what you were rehearsing internally. And you would begin to, again, change the neurological circuits in your brain to be ahead of your environment. And if you allowed yourself to emotionally embrace what that experience would be like, you would begin to signal your body emotionally and begin to turn on new genes in new ways. And by doing it properly, you can move literally from the old self to a new self just by the inward process. And if you said to yourself, I'm not getting up until I am this person, that's when you begin to move beyond yourself. That's when you lock into a new state of being and you get up in that modified state, and you can maintain that modified state your entire day, independent of the conditions in your life. Get ready, because something unusual is going to happen in your life. That's the quantum law. You're going to walk out in a new state of being, and the environment is going to organize itself to reflect who you are. Because otherwise it's just an intellectual process. You've got to condition the body to a new mind. If you want wealth in your life, you can't get up as a person in lack. You better get up as the wealthiest woman you ever met. And your body has to be convinced emotionally that you're experiencing that future reality in the present moment, because your body is the unconscious mind, does not know the difference between an experience in your life that produces an emotion that you fabricate just by thought alone. To the body, it experiences it emotionally as if it was happening. So you can begin to change your body to be ahead of the environment by signaling new genes in new ways, because a new emotion is new information from the environment, and that's when the body begins to believe that you are wealthy. Think about this. I said earlier that when you think certain thoughts, you turn on different circuits in your brain to produce a level of mind that stimulates another part of your brain to make a chemical for you to feel exactly the way you were just thinking. The moment you feel the way you think, you begin to think the way you feel. Now, that cycle of thinking and feeling, as we said, conditions the body to be a mind, and that's a habit when the body is the mind. We train the servant, called the body, to become the master. Now, once the servant has become the master kind of goes to sleep, and the servant's running the show. So the body as the mind is really running the show, and all of a sudden the person wants to sit the body down or make some changes, and all of a sudden the master reappears on the scene. What do you think the body's going to say? It's going to say, where you been? I've been doing this for the last 25 years. You think you've been making all the choices, and basically I've been making all the choices for you. So when the person begins to say they're suffering or they feel victimized by their life, to no longer think those thoughts and to no longer embrace those emotions and no longer demonstrate certain behaviors, they break that chemical continuity that's become so familiar to them. That's their identity, so comfortable. The moment they stop reinforcing that same chemical state, the body's no longer getting the same chemical messages. So it begins to revolt by sending signals back to the brain. And this is when the body starts saying, you can't do this, start tomorrow, you're too much like your mother, you'll never change, this doesn't feel good, what's wrong with you? All that chatter is the body really, as an unbridled horse, as an untrained animal, causing the person to return back to its familiar self. And the moment we respond to those voices as if they're true, consciousness immerses itself back in the program and we return back to the same self. Now, this is really the work. The work is when your body is beginning to respond, and you know it's just your body because it's been trained unconsciously, and your body begins to revolt like that, and you say, is that all you got? That's it? Because I'm going to sit here, and I'm going to wait till you're done. And when you're done, I'm going to recondition you to a new mind, and you're going to be so happy that you're happy. Now, that type of effort is how self-love is born. Because right on the other side of your impatience is absolute courage. Right on the other side of your anger is compassion. Right on the other side of your confusion is knowingness. It's the same energy. It's just trapped in the body. And when you're willing to ride that stallion just a little bit longer, there'll come a moment where the body finally acquiesces to a new mind. And when that happens, there's a literal liberation of energy because the body's freed from the chains of those emotional addictions that pretty much are driven by those survival hormones. And when the body is free from that addiction, the side effect is called joy. The person begins to relax into the present moment. They're no longer thinking about the future or worried about the past. They're completely in the present. And the body now is no longer believing it's in the future or in the past, because if a feeling and emotion is the end product of a past experience, and those feelings and emotions are driving your thoughts, then for the most part, you're thinking in the past. And your body, as the unconscious mind, memorizes an emotion. It literally believes it's in the past. So how can you go to a new future holding on to the emotions of the past? It's impossible. But the moment you fall into the present moment, the body's free. That overcoming of self, that transformation of self, that conquering of self creates self-love. And that's when you begin to respect yourself and you begin to respect all of life, and you don't have to look outside of you to try to make those feelings go away. You've actually liberated yourself from yourself. When the research has been done on meditation, there tends to be coherence between the brain and the heart, and there tends to be orderliness that's created in the mind and body. Now, incoherence is when all these different waves, brain waves, are way out of balance. There's disintegration, there's disorderliness, there's incoherence, like a band out of tune or a bunch of drummers out of beat. When you're running the hormones of stress and you're experiencing anger or hatred or aggression or frustration or judgment or fear or anxiety or hopelessness or powerlessness or depression, anxiety, all those sadness, all of those emotions turn on pretty strong chemicals that begin to cause the brain to become more compartmentalized, and the heart to move out of rhythm. And when that happens, the disorderly information that the brain is processing sends very disorderly signals to the body, and the disorderly signals from the heart send disorderly signals to the brain, and that disorderliness is what begins to cause the immune system become out of balance and produce some really unhealthy cells. The cardiovascular system is now losing its timing. The digestive system now is no longer functioning in order, and people start to experience the effects. Now, when we begin to meditate, and there's a point where we begin to move into a state of coherence or a state of orderliness, when that happens, different compartments of the brain that were no longer communicating with each other, they begin to get back online and they begin to communicate in a more holistic fashion. And now the drummers are all in beat. Now the brain and heart are working in rhythm. Now that there's a laser effect that's being created, and there's systematic order, and the nervous system and the lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system all begin to work in the same type of harmony or harmonic. That state of wholeness is when the hormonal centers in the body literally turn off. The adrenal glands, the digestive glands, the sexual glands, all that energy shuts down, because in a true meditation, when you get beyond yourself, you're no longer the same identity. That's my definition of a good meditation, when I forget about myself, forget about my association to things in my life, problems, people, places, and all that stuff. The external environment disappears. The moment you're no longer that same identity, the energy that was in those hormonal centers, those survival centers, moves into the heart, and the heart begins to open up. At the same time, the brain begins to settle down, and it moves into a slower brainwave pattern. You're no longer functioning in that high beta wave pattern where you're believing that the outer world is more real than the inner world. In that mystical state, when your brain moves into coherent alpha patterns, the inner world now is more real than the outer world, and that's when the visions and reality begins to change. The type of breath that I like to use before a meditation, I don't breathe to be spiritual, and I don't breathe to oxygenate my brain or I don't breathe to switch from the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system, although all of those things happen when we properly construct the breath. But I breathe for one simple reason, and that is to pull the mind out of the body, to move from those survival centers to the creative centers, to begin to change my energy and to pull energy back into the brain. And so if we've conditioned the body to be the mind emotionally, the emotions are energy in motion, then there's a lot of energy in the body that has to be liberated. So there's a tube that runs from your perineum, that's the space between things down there, all the way up to your brain. And the yogis called it the prana tube. It's also called the string in other cultures. And it's a tube that energy travels up. And you may say, well, I never felt that tube. And I would say, well, you never felt your nose either until you put your awareness there. When you begin to put your awareness on this tube, it becomes very real. So when you sit up straight and you contract your intrinsic muscles, your perineum muscles, those lower pelvic floor muscles, and you pull them up, and at the same time you pull in your lower abdomen and you pull in your upper abdomen, when you squeeze those muscles, and I call it tightening the locks, when you tighten down those locks and you begin to contract in there, something amazing happens. You begin to push a little cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid in your spinal cord column area, to move towards the brain. And that cerebral spinal fluid is very, very rich in charged molecules, proteins and ions in solution. And as you squeeze and you inhale through your nose as you squeeze those muscles and take one slow, steady breath, you're literally causing the cerebral spinal fluid to move back to the brain. And when you accelerate those charged particles, it creates an electrical field around the spine, or what's called an inductance field. When that happens, the information that's traveling up and down the spinal cord is moving from the brain to the body and body to the brain. It's like a fiber optic cable where information is moving in both directions. Well, as you inhale and you pull that energy up, it's causing a circular spiral to move up the spine, that inductance field, and now all the energy is moving in one direction. It's no longer moving from the brain to the body. All of the energy is moving from the body to the brain, and that's what begins to vacuum or draw energy out of those emotional centers, and that coaxing of that kundalini energy, that coaxing of that survival energy begins to move back towards the brain, and when it reaches the brain, it tends to sedate the ego, and it tends to slow down brainwave patterns and the analytical thought processes that we normally live by. And that's when we begin to prepare the brain for a greater mind or a greater consciousness. So we do that because it really produces some pretty great effects for people. When you understand what you're doing, and a person may have an emotional trauma stored in their body, or they may have years of unworthiness that is just dense energy. When you make the effort to pull the mind out of the body, now you're using your body as an instrument of consciousness, and you're ascending your energy. You're ascending your energy out of those lower vibrational centers that are in those chakras that have to do with your sexual identity or your guilt or your shame or your importance or your control or, your aggression. You're basically saying, that's the animal aspect of me, and I'm interested in becoming divine. And I'm going to, by volition, using my breath as my intention, I'm going to begin to transmute the flesh. And when you begin to move that energy and it reaches the brain, the electromagnetic field that surrounds the body is just the same exact electromagnetic field as a magnet. And now you're running energy through your body, and now you are more energy and less matter. For children, the inner world is more real than the outer world. That's why they can pretend so well. You can tell a child to act like a rabbit at 9 in the morning, and it's 6 in the evening, and they're still hopping around because they have no identity to hold on to because their brain is so neuroplastic. And so they learn by allegory. They learn by storytelling. They learn by example. So some of the rules that I like to call rules, and for me in raising my children, Number one, never reason with your kids when they're emotional, because no new information can enter into their nervous system that isn't equal to the emotion they're experiencing. And I always use the example, do you want to be reasoned with when you're emotional, or do you want to be left alone? Wait for the emotions, the chemicals to wear off before you try to reason with your children, and the same with parents. And when you teach your children how to shorten their emotional reactions to things in their life, that's called emotional intelligence. And those chemicals, I used to tell my kids, the chemicals that you react to your life with, they only last 90 seconds to 2 minutes in your body. So if you're angry for more than 2 minutes, you're faking it. You're keeping it going. So when you teach children how to move through emotions, express them, and be done with them, then they tend to no longer take those emotions and turn them into moods and temperament, into personality traits. It's an opportunity for them to really get beyond some pretty tough problems later on in their life. That's the number one thing. And then I always tell parents to lead by example. Children have a type of neurons called mirror neurons. They're empathy neurons. That's why when a mother is feeding a child and she's got the food on the spoon and she's sticking the food in the child's mouth, she's sticking her tongue out and opening her mouth because she wants the child to model her behavior. So children, they pay attention to what you do more than what you say. So the fastest track to enlightenment with children is being the living example of everything you want them to be. So that takes quite a bit of courage, and it takes quite a bit of conscious effort to, you can't say to a child, clean your room and have a messy room. It's not going to work for them because they're going to be observing you as their steward or their caregiver. Now, teaching children some of the laws of the quantum model of reality, they have such a high level of acceptance that they take exactly what you say to be the way it is. And so when the children are young, we did this with our kids. We took 3 different planters, and we took one planter and we told them, we planted a corn seed in there, and we told my 2 older kids, now, if you have any anger, any hatred, any negative emotion, we want you to put all of that negative energy that you have into this seed here. And then the next pot, we said, okay, now all the love that you have, love this seed and nurture it and hope for the best for it. And the last pot, pay no attention to it at all. It'll be the control group. And boy, when my kids saw the way that in some cases, when we did this, the negative emotion seed wouldn't even grow. It would die before it grew. And when they saw how much the love seed grew, they were astonished that it grew twice to 3 times the height. And my theory with children is if you give them the facts, they interpret the loss. And I remember my daughter sitting one time, and her friend was doing something, and she wasn't reacting. And my son said something to her, and she said, I'm not going to react that way because that wouldn't be loving to myself. And I thought, wow, for a 10-year-old kid to figure that out. And my daughter to this day still makes the same decisions in the same way for herself, to make a decision if it's loving to herself. So children, they begin to understand the laws when they experiment with the nature of reality. Now, from that point, my kids have, created amazing things where they just understand that there's a universal intelligence that they're connected to that they could use. And I can remember my kids when they were in their early teens, they would see people and say to me, in a whisper, do they know they're creating their own reality like that? They have a good sensibility, and so they're very focused. And we just always had a pact when they got above 16 that they had to create things in their life without any help of mine, that they had to create experiences using the quantum field. And, of course, they've, created trips to Nicaragua, unlimited shopping sprees, music videos, and MTV, summers in Italy. They've done amazing things and without any of my help. So happy to see that they're engaged with that at that level. Well, I wrote Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself because we had such a demand after people read Evolve Your Brain. They said, we understand the science, we understand it's possible, you've proven it to us, but now that we know, how do we learn how to do it? What's the how-to process? And so, Breaking the Habit is really the companion book to the Neuroscience of Change and how the quantum model of reality plays into it. So I wrote the book with two intentions, to simplify it to such a degree that it's understandable, because my first book was very scientific. And then secondly, give people the meditations and the tools to practice it and apply it to their life. And I didn't want it to just be dinner conversation. I wanted for people to begin to see that when they got to the second part of the book, that there was nothing left to conjecture, nothing left to dogma or speculation. When they got to the meditation, they knew exactly what they were doing and why. And once you understand the whys and how it all works, then applying it becomes the easy part. So I really, in the book, worked on making it simple and at the same time practical for people, so when they apply it, they can make some changes for themselves. I really have a real passion to demystify the mystical. I love to be able to close the gap to some degree and make it really practical and make it simple. And I always think about, if I can explain this to my mother, I can explain it to anybody. So in my life, I really want to be the living example of pretty much everything that I teach. And I'm sincere about making a difference in some way in the world, but I don't really focus on the details. I don't really say, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. I'm just very clear on my purpose, and then I let the universe guide me. And if it takes me into international realms or it takes me towards many, many opportunities, then I'm humbled and honored to be able to contribute. So I trust the universe in that way. So I feel very blessed most of the time. The big thing, as we were saying earlier, is that this is a time in history where so many different paradigms are breaking down, and we can't rely on anybody outside of us to change us. That this is a time where we have to really cinch it in and begin to be the living example of all the changes we want to see. And secondly, and most importantly, if you woke up in the morning and instead of getting out of bed and doing the same thing that you did the day before, what if you woke up in the morning and you said, what is the greatest ideal of myself that I can be today? And you said, I'm not getting out of bed until I am this person, and I want to make contact with the divine. I want it to move in me. I want it to move through me. I want it to move all around me. I want to see evidence in my life. If I emulate the Creator, if I observe reality, and I emulate the observer, then I want a sign in my life that I've made contact with this intelligence, that it's real, that I'm an extension of it. And if I can stay in this state the entire day and not fall from grace, then I should see some evidence somewhere in my life. And as we begin to remove the masks and the layers that block the flow of that rich intelligence within us, as we begin to remove the facades that stand in the way for our expression of the divine, I think that intelligence begins to leak out of us. And when it moves through us and leaks out of us, we become more like it. We become more loving because that's its mind. We become more giving, that's its mind. We become more willful, more intelligent. We become more resourceful because that's more joyful, that's its mind. And so when that happens, and we are expressing that through us, I think that's our true purpose in life. And again, it gives people permission to do the same.